Marcus Hill had never been the kind of man who made wishes. He had tried that once, a long time ago, standing in a hospital corridor with a paper cup of cold coffee in his hand and a prayer on his lips that went unanswered. After that night, he stopped asking the universe for things it clearly had no intention of giving. He learned instead to work with what he had: a pair of reliable hands, a calm disposition, and a house in the suburbs of Atlanta that was just big enough to feel lived in, but small enough to keep clean on a Saturday morning. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with a voice that came from somewhere low and steady, the kind of voice that made children stop crying and grown men reconsider arguments. His neighbors on Clover Street knew him as the man who brought groceries to old Mrs. Patterson when her hip flared up, the man who jump-started dead batteries at 6 in the morning without being asked, the man who never locked his tools away when someone needed to borrow them. Marcus Hill was the kind of man people forgot to appreciate until the day he wasn't there anymore, and he had learned to be at peace with that. He ran a small auto repair shop. Or rather, he managed it, which meant he was the last one in at night and the first one in at dawn. And on most days, the line between managing and doing the work himself was invisible. The shop sat on the corner of Whitmore Avenue, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese sandwich place whose owner, a compact man named Danny, brought him banh mi every Tuesday and Thursday without explanation or expectation. Marcus had 11 employees, a loyal customer base built over 14 years, and a waiting list for engine work that stretched 3 weeks out. He wasn't rich. He was something more durable than rich. He was solvent, respected, and deeply, privately tired in the way that only single fathers understand, except Marcus's daughter, Lily, was 19 now and studying architecture in Savannah, which meant the tiredness had shed its purpose and become something quieter and harder to name. The house echoed in ways it hadn't used to. He cooked dinner for one and ate in front of the window, watching the streetlights come on one by one like slow applause for another ordinary evening. He told himself he liked it this way. Most nights, he almost believed it. It was a Thursday, when everything began to unspool, though it didn't announce itself as a Thursday of consequence. It announced itself as a Thursday that smelled like motor oil and brake fluid, and the particular metallic sweetness of a transmission in distress. Marcus had closed the shop at 6:30, a full hour later than planned, because a 1972 Chevelle had arrived on a flatbed and its owner, an elderly man named Harold, had stood in the parking lot with such a look of bereavement on his face that Marcus had stayed to at least diagnose the problem before sending him home. The Chevelle needed a carburetor rebuild, a week's worth of work, and Harold had shaken Marcus's hand with both of his and said thank you in a way that made the overtime feel worthwhile. Marcus had changed out of his work shirt in the back office, locked the gate, and driven to Promenade Coffee on Decatur Street, because it was on the way home, and because he had been going there on Thursday evenings for 9 years, and there was a comfort in that kind of loyalty that money could not manufacture. He ordered a large dark roast, no sugar, and settled into his usual corner table near the window, opened a dog-eared novel about a lighthouse keeper, and prepared to be nobody in particular for the next hour. She was sitting 2 tables away, and she was trying very hard not to be looked at. Marcus noticed this, not because he was looking at her, he wasn't, but because the particular effort of not being noticed has a texture to it, a certain deliberate stillness that reads as its own kind of signal. She wore a gray hoodie, hood down, dark jeans, no jewelry that he could see, and she was stirring a cup of tea with the mechanical repetition of someone who had forgotten she was doing it. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she had done it herself without a mirror. She was pretty in the way that certain people are pretty when they aren't trying, not assembled. Just present, features that work together without announcement. She couldn't have been more than 40, though she had the eyes of someone who had been awake and paying attention for much longer than that. What struck Marcus was not her appearance but her expression, which was the expression of a person who had arrived somewhere expecting to exhale and found that the exhale kept not coming. He recognized that expression. He had worn it himself, in the months after his wife Elena had died, when he would go to places they used to go and sit very still and wait for peace that arrived in fragments so small, you almost missed them. He went back to his lighthouse keeper. She went on stirring her tea. The coffee shop was nearly empty. A college student in the far corner, a barista wiping down equipment, the hum of the refrigerator case. Then the woman's phone lit up on the table, and she looked at it, and whatever she saw made her close her eyes for a moment. The way people close their eyes when they are deciding not to react to something. She put the phone face down. She looked up, and Marcus happened to be looking in her direction at that precise second, not at her, but at the street behind her, which was wet with the beginning of rain. Their eyes met, and she gave him the small, exhausted smile that strangers exchange in late-night diners and empty waiting rooms. Not friendliness exactly, more like acknowledgement. I see you there being a person. I, too, am being a person. We are in the same room. Marcus nodded once and looked back at his book. Is it good? She asked. He looked up. She was gesturing at the novel. Slow start, he said. But I've read it before. It gets better. That's a generous way to recommend a book. I wasn't recommending it. Just answering your question. She almost smiled at that. Not the exhausted kind. Something more genuine. Fair enough, she said. Then, after a pause, do you come here often? Sorry, that's a terrible opening line. Thursday evenings, Marcus said. 9 years? That's commitment. Or habit. Hard to tell the difference after a certain point. She picked up her tea, finally stopped stirring it. I came here because I needed a place that didn't know me. Does that make sense? More than you'd think, he said. And because she had said something honest, he said something honest back. I come here because it's quiet, and nobody asks me anything. Seems like we're here for similar reasons. Her name, she said, was Vanessa. She didn't offer a last name, and he didn't ask. He told her his name was Marcus, and that he fixed cars for a living, and she said that sounded satisfying in a way she couldn't entirely articulate, the idea of a thing being broken, and then being made not broken, through the application of knowledge and patience. He agreed that it was, on good days. They talked about cars briefly, then drifted to the neighborhood, then to the city, and somewhere in the middle of a conversation about Atlanta's traffic and whether the new transit expansion would actually happen in their lifetimes, the distance between two strangers in a coffee shop began to close in the imperceptible way it does when two people are paying genuine attention to each other. Marcus found himself noticing things, the way she spoke in complete, precise sentences that suggested someone who had spent years being misquoted and had learned to leave no room for interpretation. The way she laughed, not freely, not yet, but building towards something, like a woman who had forgotten she was allowed to laugh and was carefully remembering. He didn't know who she was. He had no reason to know. He was a man who read novels in coffee shops and rebuilt carburetors and brought groceries to old women with bad hips, and the names of technology billionaires were not part of his landscape. Vanessa Reed, had Marcus known the name, would have explained the quality of her coat, the precision of her vocabulary, the exhausted vigilance behind her eyes. Vanessa Reed had founded Datasphere Technologies at 26 with a half-finished business plan, a rented server room, and enough conviction to convince 3 investors to take a chance on something they didn't fully understand. By 32, Datasphere had become the kind of company whose name appeared in sentences with words like dominant and disruptive and paradigm shifting. By 39, she was worth more than $2 billion, had been on the covers of 4 national magazines, had given a commencement address at MIT, and had not, in recent memory, eaten a meal with someone who wasn't calculating the return on her attention. She had an estate in Buckhead that had been profiled in an architectural magazine as an example of modern restraint, which meant it was very large and very beautiful and contained, at any given time, between 8 and 12 people, whose salaries she paid and who called her Miss. Reed with a deference that had begun to feel suffocating in a way she couldn't explain to anyone without sounding ungrateful. She was 39 years old, and she had built something extraordinary, and she sat in a coffee shop on a Thursday evening in a gray hoodie because it was the only place she had thought to go when the walls of her extraordinary life had started pressing in. She didn't tell Marcus any of this. She told him she worked in technology, which was true, and that it had become difficult to separate the work from the self, which was also true, and that she lived alone in a house that was, she said, choosing her words carefully, too much for one person. Marcus had looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup and said, without any particular drama, "Sounds like a very expensive way to be lonely." She had gone quiet for a moment, not offended. Something more like struck. As if the sentence had located something she had been circling for months without being able to touch. "My therapist says something similar," she said, but less concisely. "Your therapist is getting paid by the hour," Marcus said. "I've got no reason to stretch it out." She laughed, then actually laughed, the free kind, the kind that surprised her. And Marcus felt something shift in the air between them. Not romantic, not yet, but human. The specific warmth of two people who have stopped performing for each other and started simply talking. She told him about the pressure of it, the way every relationship, professional and personal, was filtered through the screen of her net worth. The way she could never be certain whether someone liked her or liked what she represented. The way she had grown so accustomed to people wanting things from her that she had started to preemptively distrust everyone, which was exhausting in a different and more corrosive way. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was, she would later think, itself remarkable. Most people who listened to problems were assembling their response while she was still speaking. Marcus seemed to actually hear her, to let the words land somewhere before he said anything back. "You know what your problem is?" he said when she finished. "I'm sure you're going to tell me. You've spent so long being a balance sheet that you've forgotten you're a person. Every room you walk into, someone's already decided what you're worth. That's not a life. That's a performance review." She stared at him. "That's either the wisest thing anyone's said to me in years or the most presumptuous." "Probably both," he said cheerfully, and took a sip of his coffee. "I've been told I have that gift." The rain outside had become something more serious, and neither of them moved toward the door. The barista brought them refills without being asked. The college student in the corner packed up and left. The conversation moved through territory that conversations rarely reach on first acquaintance, the strange arithmetic of grief, the way success could function as insulation that also kept warmth out, the things that people held on to, not because they were good, but because they were familiar. Marcus told her about Elena. Not much, not the way grief pours out when it's still new, but the way it sits when it's been lived with for a long time, matter of fact, and still, with a tenderness at the edges. He told her that losing his wife had rearranged his understanding of what mattered, had burned away his tolerance for pretense, and left him with a kind of radical simplicity that he hadn't chosen but had come to value. He told her that Lily called every Sunday, and that was the best part of his week. Vanessa listened the way she had hoped he would listen to her. "I don't have that," she said. "I don't have a Sunday call. I have a board meeting at 9 and a PR strategy review at 2. That's your Monday through Friday. What do you have on Sundays?" She thought about it genuinely. "The house," she said finally. "And whoever's working that day?" Marcus shook his head slowly, not unkindly. "You know what that sounds like? You know what that actually sounds like? Tell me." "Sounds like you're living in a very beautiful prison." He paused. "Very beautiful, very large, very well-catered prison. But still," she laughed again, shorter this time, because it was funny and also because it wasn't. "So what's your expert prescription, Dr. Marcus? Trade the estate for a studio apartment and find myself?" "Nah," he said. "I'd start smaller. Start with a Thursday evening in a coffee shop where nobody knows your name. I'm already doing that. Then, you're already ahead of schedule." He stood up, reaching for his jacket. "I should get home. It's a work day tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment, the easy assessment of a man who called things what they were. "For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth much, coming from a stranger you seem like a person who's got more going on inside than the story you've been telling yourself. Maybe let somebody in on that sometime. Might be surprised." She looked up at him with something unreadable in her expression. "Your house," she said. "The one that's just right for one person. You ever get lonely in it?" "Sure," he said, without embarrassment. "Most evenings between 7 and 9. Then I read, and it passes. And if I told you my biennial residence was making me feel emptier than I've ever felt in my life, what would you say?" He smiled, pulling on his jacket, the smile of a man who was not taking himself seriously. I'd say if you ever get so tired of your fancy biennial that you want a change of scenery, you're welcome to come take the other side of the couch. Plenty of room, and the coffee's decent. He spread his hands in a self-deprecating gesture. It's a joke, obviously. Go home, Vanessa. Get some sleep. She was still looking at him with that same unreadable expression. Obviously, she said. He said good night, stepped out into the rain, walked to his truck, and drove home thinking about nothing in particular, except that he hadn't had a conversation that good in longer than he could easily remember. He got home, made himself a sandwich, finished 2 chapters of the Lighthouse Keeper novel, and went to bed. By 10:30 he was asleep, and the evening had taken its place among the pleasant, ordinary evenings that made up the texture of his life. He was not expecting the doorbell to ring at 7:03 the following morning. He heard it in the middle of tying his left boot, that specific 2-note tone he had installed himself and had been meaning to replace for 3 years. He finished the knot, went to the door in his work shirt and jeans, and opened it without ceremony, expecting the FedEx driver or his neighbor Gerald, who sometimes brought over excess zucchini from his garden, both of whom he could deal with in under 90 seconds. It was not Gerald with zucchini. Vanessa Reed stood on his front porch, in the pale morning light, wearing dark slacks and a charcoal blazer, her hair pulled back with the same unself-conscious efficiency as the night before. Beside her, one on each side like sentinels, were 2 large rolling suitcases, black, matching, expensive. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she had thought about this decision, and made it and was not entertaining second thoughts. Marcus looked at her. He looked at the suitcases. He looked back at her. No, he said. You said I could. I was joking. I know. But I've been thinking about it since you left, and I realized I didn't want it to be a joke. Her voice was even deliberate, the voice of someone who chaired board meetings and closed funding rounds, and was accustomed to people listening carefully when she spoke. I have 17,000 square feet in Buckhead. I have a household staff of 9. I have a chef who has trained at 3 Michelin-starred restaurants, and I haven't eaten a meal in that house in 2 weeks that didn't feel like a performance. I have a driver who takes me places I don't want to go. I have a publicist who tells me what to say, and 2 assistants who manage my calendar so thoroughly that I cannot remember the last time I chose how to spend an hour on my own recognizance. She paused. You have a small house in a neighborhood where people apparently know each other. You fix things with your hands. You eat dinner by the window. You have a daughter who calls on Sundays. I don't know what any of that feels like, and I think I need to find out. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Down the street, a sprinkler came on. A dog barked twice and went quiet. In the kitchen behind him, the coffee maker finished its cycle with a soft, gurgling sigh. He was aware that his neighbor Donna had come out onto her porch 2 houses down with a watering can and had gone very still. You looked me up, he said. After last night, I confirmed your name and address. Yes, and you still came. That's correct. He looked at the suitcases again. They were the kind of suitcases that cost more than his first car. There's 1 bedroom, he said. I'll take the couch. The couch is not comfortable. I know about uncomfortable couches in theory. I'm willing to learn about them in practice. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more reluctant and more genuine than a smile. He stepped back from the door. Guest rule number 1, he said. Nobody leaves dishes in the sink. Understood. Rule number 2. I leave the house at 6:45 in the morning. If you need a ride somewhere, you need to be ready at 6:45. I can arrange my own transportation. Rule number 2, he said again, more firmly, and she heard something in his tone that was not negotiating. We don't bring the other life in here. You want to be a regular person? You do it like a regular person. That means if I'm heading somewhere and it's on the way, you get a ride in the truck. No car service at the curb. She considered this for exactly 3 seconds. Agreed. He picked up one of the suitcases. It was remarkably heavy, and he raised an eyebrow at her and carried it through the door. She picked up the other one and followed him in. The door swung shut behind them, and down the street, Donna set down her watering can and went directly inside to call 3 people. The collision of 2 worlds, when it actually arrived, was stranger and more consistently funny than either of them had anticipated. Marcus's house was clean in the practical way of a person who cleaned because a dirty house made him restless, not because cleanliness was a performance for anyone else. The living room held a well-worn sofa, a bookshelf that had been alphabetized and then lived in until the alphabetization was only theoretical, a television that was adequately sized, and a coffee table with a ring stain that he had been telling himself for years he would refinish. The kitchen had copper pots that were actually used, a cast-iron skillet that had been seasoned over 15 years into something approaching perfection, and a refrigerator covered in magnets from places Lily had visited and photographs held in place by those magnets. It was the home of a person, unambiguously, and Vanessa stood in the middle of it on the first morning and took it in with the careful attention of someone visiting a foreign country whose customs she was determined to master. The first crisis arrived before breakfast. Marcus asked her to start the coffee maker, while he fed the neighbor's cat, a standing arrangement with Gerald that had somehow extended to include most of the block's animals, and returned 6 minutes later to find Vanessa standing in front of the coffee maker with the expression of a woman who had stared down hostile venture capitalists and hostile journalists and was unwilling to admit that a domestic appliance had defeated her. "It requires a filter," she said, with dignity. "I was not informed of the filter." Marcus showed her where the filters were kept, walked her through the process, and did not say a single word that could be reasonably construed as condescending. He told her later, and this was a thing Vanessa would remember, that not knowing something was different from being incapable of learning it, and the second quality was the only one worth worrying about. By the third day, she could operate the coffee maker without supervision. By the end of the first week, she had graduated to the washing machine, which had been a more involved negotiation, involving the difference between delicate cycle and normal cycle, and why the sorting of clothes by color was not an arbitrary rule invented to inconvenience people. Marcus discovered in these sessions a patience he hadn't realized he still had, the patient that comes not from obligation, but from genuine interest in watching a person discover something for the first time. Vanessa discovered, for her part, that ordinary tasks done with her own hands produced a small but insistent satisfaction that no amount of delegating had ever generated. She washed her own dishes and felt obscurely proud. She sorted laundry and experienced something that took her several days to identify as competence. She went to the grocery store with Marcus on a Saturday morning. Her first solo grocery expedition had been 2 days prior and had resulted in 20 minutes of standing in the cereal aisle, holding 2 boxes, and being unable to make a decision, which had frightened her more than any board meeting ever had. And by the time they reached the produce section, she was arguing confidently about the relative merits of 2 varieties of peaches. Marcus watched her fall into the ordinary rhythms of an ordinary life with the quiet attention of a man who understood that what he was watching was not comedy, though it had comedic elements, but something more like thawing. The particular thawing of a person who has been held very rigid by their circumstances for a very long time. He saw it in small things. The way she sat differently on the couch by the 5th day, not perched and alert, as if ready to be called upon, but settled, with her legs tucked under her and a book she had taken from his shelf open across her lap. The way she stopped looking at her phone every 3 minutes, and eventually left it on the charger in the morning without checking it first. The way she laughed, which continued to get freer and quicker, until one evening, watching a nature documentary in which a sea otter failed magnificently to crack open a shell, she laughed so hard she had to put down her tea, and she looked surprised by herself, and then laughed a little more. He told her about Elena, the way he had told her the night they met, not as a wound being shown, but as a part of his landscape being described. Elena, who had been a school librarian with opinions about coffee and a magnificent unwillingness to be hurried, who had died of a cardiac event at 38 with no warning and no precedent, on a Wednesday afternoon in March, while Marcus was installing a timing belt and Lily was at school learning about the water cycle. He had not told the story many times. It was not a story he shared with casual frequency. But Vanessa listened, with a particular quality of stillness that made telling it feel appropriate, and when he finished, she did not offer the standard expressions of sympathy that he had learned to receive and acknowledge and move past. She said, She sounds like the kind of person who made the room better just by being in it. And Marcus had looked at her for a moment and said, yeah, she was exactly that. Vanessa told him, in return, about her childhood, which was the inverse of what her life had become. A two-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, a mother who worked second shift at a textile plant, the particular ingenuity of poverty that teaches you to solve problems with whatever is available. She had been brilliant and driven and hungry in the way that children who grow up watching their parents work hard and still not have enough become hungry, with a quality of determination that doesn't come from ambition alone, but from something older and more urgent. She had gotten a scholarship, then another, then a degree, then a startup, then a company, and somewhere in the escalating speed of that ascent, she had lost the thread of the person she had been before the world started telling her who she was worth. Her family, a mother who was now comfortable, two brothers who were employed in positions she had created for them, had a relationship with her that was warm in the way of people who are also waiting for the next favor, the next check, the next intervention. She loved them. She was not able to trust them, which was a loneliness of its own particular variety. My assistant once asked me, Vanessa said, sitting at Marcus's kitchen table with a mug of tea, what I did for fun, and I said work. And she said, no, what do you do for fun? And I said work again, and I meant it. And she never asked again. She looked down at the mug. I thought it was strength. Turns out it was just I didn't know what else to say. What do you think the answer is now? Marcus asked. She was quiet for a moment. Grocery stores, she said. Watching otters fail at shellfish, arguing about peaches. A pause. This kind of conversation. That's not nothing, he said. No, she agreed. It's really not. They were on the 9th day when the world found them, as it had been going to find them all along. Marcus had known it was coming in the abstract, the way a person knows a storm is building. In the distance he could see it, in the way Vanessa's phone had been vibrating with increasing urgency, in the messages she dismissed without opening, in the careful way she was rationing her contact with her other life, as if it were a substance she was trying to stop consuming. He had not asked. She had not offered. They had maintained, by mutual silent agreement, the suspension of her public identity within the walls of his house, and it had worked for 9 days with the fragile integrity of a dome. On the 10th morning, a news van was parked at the end of Clover Street. By noon, there were 2. By 3 in the afternoon, a photographer had gotten a shot of Vanessa carrying groceries from Marcus's truck to the front door, a photo in which she was laughing at something he had said. And that photograph was on 3 major news platforms within the hour, with headlines that ranged from speculative to contemptuous to actively cruel. Tech billionaire Vanessa Reed in secret suburban hideaway. Sources close to Datasphere. Express alarm over CEO's whereabouts. Who is the man who has Vanessa Reed carrying her own groceries? The stock dipped 4 points by market close. Her publicist called 14 times. Her PR director sent messages in a tone that graduated from urgent to furious, to something approaching existential despair. And then the board weighed in. Not with concern but with action, which was its own kind of message. An emergency statement was drafted, circulated, and released without Vanessa's approval, suggesting that Miss Reed was taking a brief personal leave, and that Datasphere's leadership team remained firmly in place and fully committed to the Q3 roadmap. One board member, a man named Elliot Graves, who had been on the board since the early days, and who wore his authority like a second skin, gave a brief statement to a financial publication in which he expressed, with careful diplomacy that was nonetheless absolutely clear in its meaning, concern about the influence of personal relationships on executive judgment. He did not name Marcus. He didn't have to. The photograph had been published everywhere, and 2 sentence profiles of Marcus Hill, auto shop manager, Atlanta, had begun to appear alongside descriptions of his modest house and unremarkable finances. The implication was not subtle. It was not intended to be subtle. Marcus saw the articles on his lunch break, sitting in the office at the back of the shop with a turkey sandwich he didn't finish. He read them with the stillness of a man who has been on the receiving end of other people's assumptions before and has learned that the first impulse, the hot, righteous impulse to respond, is rarely the correct one. He read them twice. He put his phone down and looked at the wall for a while. Then, he went back to work, because there was a transmission waiting, and Harold's Chevelle wasn't going to fix itself. He finished the transmission. He detailed the Chevelle. He drove home. Vanessa was on the phone when he came in, standing in the kitchen with her back to the door, speaking in a voice that was her other voice, the one he had not heard since the first day, precise and forceful, and stripped of the softness that had developed in the evenings on the couch with the Otter documentary. He set his keys on the hook by the door and went upstairs to change. When he came down, she was off the phone, sitting at the table with her hands folded in front of her. And she looked at him with an expression that was trying not to be apologetic. "I saw them," he said, before she could speak. "Marcus. Elliot Graves. He's on your board." "Yes." "He's not wrong," Marcus said, and his voice was quiet and matter-of-fact, and she felt it like a physical thing. "Practically speaking, he's not wrong. You have a company. You have shareholders. You have people whose livelihoods depend on your judgment being considered above reproach. He implied that you're using me. I know what he implied." "It's not true." "I know it's not true," Marcus said. "You know it's not true. That's not actually the problem." He sat down across from her. "The problem is that you came here on an impulse, and it was a good impulse. I believe that. But the world you came from doesn't run on impulses. It runs on narratives. And right now, the narrative being built around this is one that is going to follow you in ways that will be harder to undo than whatever it is we're doing here." She looked at him steadily. "What are we doing here, Marcus?" He was quiet for a moment. "Something that matters," he said. "Which is exactly why I think you should go back." The silence in the room had weight. She opened her mouth, and he held up a hand. "Not forever," he said. "Not because Graves is right or because the board gets to make decisions about your personal life, but because you haven't finished what you started. You came here to remember something, not to run away from something. And running away just means you take the thing you're running from along for the ride." He looked at his hands on the table. "You go back. You deal with it like the person you are. And then, if you want, you come back. Not because you're hiding, because you want to." She left the following morning. She did not take the suitcases. She left them in the closet by the stairs, which neither of them discussed but both understood as a statement. Marcus drove her to the edge of the neighborhood, where her car service was waiting discreetly at the corner, and they sat in the truck for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Thank you for not telling me I was being ridiculous." And he said, "You weren't being ridiculous." And she got out of the truck and walked to the waiting car and did not look back, which Marcus interpreted not as coldness, but as the disciplined forward motion of a woman who, if she looked back, might not keep walking. The house went quiet, in a way it had not been quiet before, because the silence now had a specific shape in it, the outline of a presence recently removed. Marcus fixed himself dinner and ate it at the window. He washed the dishes. He found on the kitchen counter a small yellow adhesive note that said, in her precise handwriting, "The peaches from the second stand on the right are better. You were wrong." He read it twice. He put it on the refrigerator, next to a photograph of Lily, at her first architecture review, and went to read his book. He told himself he was fine. He largely was. He had been lonely before, and he knew the shape of it, knew it was survivable, knew that it did not constitute an emergency. He went to work. He rebuilt the Chevelle's carburetor. He brought Mrs. Patterson's groceries. He ate Danny's banh mi on Tuesday and Thursday. He called Lily on Sunday, and she said, "Dad, I saw the news." And he said, "It's fine, Lily." And she said, "Dad," in the tone that meant she was not accepting that answer. And he said, "She's an interesting person. I'm glad she came." And Lily said, "Are you going to see her again?" And Marcus paused for longer than he had intended to, and said, "I don't know." And Lily said, "Dad, you paused." And he laughed, and the laugh was more real than he had expected it to be. Vanessa Reed did not disappear back into her life as cleanly as the architecture of her return had suggested. She appeared on the cover of a business magazine 10 days after she left Marcus's house, and the interview inside was notable to people who followed these things because it contained sentences that her publicist had not approved, and that her PR director read 3 times in a row with increasing bewilderment. She said that she had taken a short leave because she had needed to be reminded of things she had forgotten. She said she had been reminded. She said that the version of herself that ran Datasphere was not the whole of who she was, and that she intended to hold on to both versions with greater intention going forward. When the interviewer asked what had reminded her, she said, "A conversation and a very decent cup of coffee." The stock recovered. Elliot Graves gave no further statements, but the estate felt different when she returned to it. She noticed this in the first evening, standing in the kitchen of her Buckhead home while her chef, a quietly extraordinary man named Pierre, prepared a meal that smelled wonderful, and that she would eat alone at a table that seated 12. And she thought about Marcus eating at his window, and the thought had a tenderness in it that she recognized from the evenings on his couch, that specific tenderness of something that has stopped being abstract and become real. She told Pierre she would cook her own dinner that night. He looked at her with the professional discretion of a man who had spent years translating her preferences into meals, and said of course, and cleared the kitchen with the graceful efficiency of someone who had been well trained not to question. She made scrambled eggs, which she had now done 3 times, and was beginning to get right, and ate them at the kitchen island, and found the meal entirely satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with Pierre's considerable talent, and everything to do with having made it herself. She called her brother in Columbus. She called her mother. She called a friend she had not spoken to in 2 years, not because anything had happened to end the friendship, but because she had simply kept not calling, and neither had the friend, and the silence had become its own kind of barrier. The friend answered on the second ring and said, "Vanessa, it's been forever." And Vanessa said, "I know. I'm sorry. I've been a little lost." And the friend said, "That happens. I'm glad you're calling." And they talked for an hour about nothing consequential, about the friend's children and a movie they had both seen years ago, and whether Vanessa had ever been to New Mexico, which she had not. And by the end of the call, Vanessa felt something she struggled to name, but that was adjacent to relief. The steady, generous return of a person to her own life. She did not call Marcus. She thought about it with a frequency she declined to track too carefully. She was not avoiding it. She was gathering something, the way a person gathers themselves before doing something that matters, taking stock of what she felt, and whether what she felt was sufficient to the weight of what it would require. Because calling Marcus Hill was not a simple thing, and she knew it. He was not a project, or a decision, or a chapter. He was a person who had looked at her without calculation in a coffee shop on a Thursday evening and told her that she was more than her balance sheet, and that quality of being seen, clearly not for what she had built or what she was worth, but for what was actually there, was something that, once experienced, she could no longer pretend to be indifferent to. She walked through her Buckhead estate in the evenings, through rooms that an interior designer had spent 14 months perfecting, and she tried to locate herself in them. The library held first editions, and she had read perhaps 3 of them. The home gym had equipment that her trainer operated on her behalf. The terrace overlooked a garden that 4 people maintained on a rotating schedule, and it was beautiful in the way that photographs of gardens are beautiful, composed and immaculate, and untouched by anyone actually living in it. She sat on the terrace one evening with a glass of wine and watched the city lights come on across the distance, and tried to feel the way she had felt sitting at Marcus's kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, arguing about whether the grocery store peaches were better than the farmer's market ones, and the feeling would not come because it was not a feeling that transferred to a new location. It was specific. It lived in that kitchen. It lived in that particular arguing and that particular table and that particular person sitting across it with a patient, unhurried expression and coffee going cold at his elbow because he had forgotten to drink it while he listened to her talk. She understood now that the suitcases in his closet had not been a gesture, they had been a question, and she had been taking 31 days to formulate the answer. On the 32nd morning, she woke early, before 6, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes to people who have finally made a decision that had been generating static for weeks. She showered, dressed, she made her own coffee. She was now entirely comfortable with drip machines, and had begun to develop opinions about roast profiles, and sat at her kitchen island with a notepad on which she wrote 2 lines and then looked at them for a while, and then crossed out 1 line, and then was satisfied with what remained. She made one call to her assistant, instructing her to rearrange her morning. She ordered a car, not the full service, just a car, just transportation, and she packed 1 bag, not 2, rolling it to the door herself without calling for assistance. She looked around the kitchen of her 17,000 square foot house, with its high ceilings and its stainless steel and its profound architectural silence, and she turned off the lights and went to the door. The drive from Buckhead to Clover Street took 22 minutes. She had the driver stop at the corner. She got out and walked the rest of the way, pulling her single bag behind her on the quiet sidewalk in the early morning light. The neighborhood was just beginning to wake a car, reversing out of a driveway, the smell of someone's breakfast, a dog, trotting purposefully along the fence line of a yard. Vanessa walked slowly, in no hurry for once, taking in the particular quality of ordinary morning on an ordinary street, the way the light came through the trees at this hour, the sound of a lawn sprinkler 3 houses down. She stopped in front of Marcus's house and stood for a moment looking at it, at the second-hand porch swing and the modest garden and the truck in the driveway, that she now knew made a specific ticking sound. When the engine cooled, which she had found oddly comforting in the 2 weeks she had listened to it. She knocked. She heard footsteps. The door opened. Marcus Hill stood in the doorway in his work shirt, half ready for the day, coffee mug in hand, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had not entirely given up on something and was experiencing the particular quality of not having been wrong. He looked at the bag. 1 bag. He looked at her face. "No valet?" he said. "No valet. No team of advisors on the sidewalk? Just me." He looked at the bag again. "You packed light this time." "I packed what I needed." She held his gaze, and in her voice was something that had not been there the first time. Not the brisk decisiveness of a woman acting on impulse, but the steady, considered quality of a person who had thought all the way through and arrived at the truth. "The first time I came here, Marcus, I came because I was curious. I wanted to know what it felt like to live differently. I wanted to try on something I'd never had. That was real, but it was also selfish, in a way I didn't fully understand at the time." She paused. "I understand it now. And this time? This time I came because I know what I felt in this house. I know what I felt in that grocery store arguing about peaches. I know what I felt sitting on that couch watching a sea otter fail spectacularly, and what I felt at your kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, talking about things that mattered, with a person who was not managing me, or measuring me, or waiting for something." She stopped. Her voice was even, but it was carrying something. "This time I came because I've spent 32 days trying to replicate that feeling in 17,000 square feet, and I can't do it. And I don't want to pretend I don't know exactly where it is and what it belongs to." Marcus stood in the doorway for a long moment. Down the street, Donna had appeared on her porch again with the watering can, which had not needed the plants in weeks, and was by this point clearly operating in an exclusively observational capacity. The morning birds were doing their morning business. The ticking of the coffee maker was audible from where Vanessa stood. Marcus stepped back from the door. "1 bedroom," he said. "I know. Uncomfortable couch. I remember. And we're going to need to discuss the peaches," he said, "because I was not wrong." She picked up her bag and she smiled. And it was not the exhausted smile of a woman trying not to be found in an empty coffee shop. And it was not the surprised laugh of a person remembering they were allowed to laugh. And it was not the brisk nod of an executive managing a situation. It was the smile of a person who had arrived somewhere she wanted to be, and knew it, and was not trying to be anything other than exactly that. She stepped through the door. He closed it behind her, gently, the way you close a door when you want to keep something in rather than keep something out. The richest person in the room is not always the one with the most to offer. Sometimes, the most valuable thing in the world is simply someone who looks at you and sees a person, not a balance sheet, not a biography, not a brand, just the actual person you are underneath all of it, and says, "There's room here. Come in." The door is open. It does not matter how large your house is, Or how many people are paid to be present in it? Or how many publications have written your name in bold at the top of a list? None of that fills a room the way one honest person can fill a room. None of it answers the question that every human being is asking in one form or another every single day. Do you see me? Is there a place for me? Does it matter that I am here? And sometimes, if you are very fortunate, and if you are brave enough, and if you happen to walk into the right coffee shop on the right Thursday evening and sit down near a man reading a lighthouse novel, the answer is yes. And the door is already open.